Now, the theory of consumer choice is the absolute staples of micro theory. It's how individuals make their decisions. And what you would have learned, and I'll probably say this an awful lot in today's lecture, I'll say things like remembering back to what you did last year, or you'll already know this. If I do it too much, I do apologise. But the basic principle is these are things that you did cover last year. And the point, I don't want to teach you this from scratch. It's just a reminder for the first part of today. So the theory of consumer choice looks at individuals and how they make their decisions. Why do they choose to do what they do? Why do they choose to consume certain goods and in certain quantities? So, the way that you would have looked at the theory of consumer choice is it would have been split up into three distinct parts. The first is that you would have looked at something about consumers' preferences, their tastes, what they want to do. That was the first part. Okay, what do the consumers, what would they like to do? What would they not like to do? What do they prefer? That was the first part of it, to say something about consumers' tastes. Then, once we know what consumers want to do, then it extends out into constraints. You might want to live in a bigger house. You might want to drive a newer car. But there are constraints that people face. It's not what they only want to do, but it's also financial constraints that people face. A budget constraint. You might like that bigger car. You might like to live in a different area. But we all face financial constraints. And the budget constraint, prices and income, would have been the way in which you analyse such constraints. So we know what consumers want to do. We know what they're constrained by. And then the last part of this theory of consumer choice that you would have seen is it integrates these two together. It brings them together and said, well, of all of the feasible things consumers can do, which one do they actually choose? So we integrate preferences and constraints. So of all of those things consumers can do, which one do they choose? On the proviso that they make their choices such that it maximises their well-being. Individuals know what they want to do, they know what they like, they know what they don't like. And they bring these tastes and preferences and these constraints together such that they maximise their well-being. They do that thing that's best for them. So that then was the basic setup to that theory of consumer choice. So what I want to give you this afternoon is just a quick step through of those three aspects here. Certainly the first two will just remind you of what's going on and what the basic diagrams will look like. And then I'll push you a little bit further with that part at the end where these decisions are brought to you. So, if I were to mention the theory of consumer choice to you and tastes and preferences, hopefully what would come rushing back to your minds and instantly jump out was this idea of an indifference curve. And if I asked you to do an indifference curve, were I to do it now, I'm hoping that you'd all start drawing these sorts of shapes in the air. An indifference curve, that very staple of consumers' tastes and preferences, typically will look something like this. That downward sloping curve from left to right. Now, when we set up consumers' preferences, we want to build this theory about how consumers choose to consume what they do. There are literally millions of goods that you could consume over. Which ones do you consume? And how many of them do you consume? Well, that's a very, very big thing to do. That's a very difficult thing to do. And when you've seen it so far, this choice that consumers make, these choices that they choose over, have only been over two goods. So what I've got in this diagram here are two goods. We've got tacos and we have hamburgers. And what our consumer is doing is choosing over not tacos and hamburgers per se, but rather bundles of goods. Different bundles that contain a certain amount of tacos and a certain amount of hamburgers. Now that would have been the way that you've dealt with it so far. And for the first part of today's lecture, again, that's exactly what I'll do. I'll do a very, very stylised example of choosing between two goods. Then I'll extend it out and show you how this can relate to a consumer's choice of any, absolutely any number of goods. For the moment though, to make it nice and easy, let's just restrict ourselves to two goods: hamburgers and tacos. And typically, an indifference curve will do this. It will slope downwards from left to right. It will not, remember, bend backwards, and it will not turn upwards at the ending. It slopes downwards from left to right. And when you draw indifference curves to me in the exam, and I can absolutely guarantee you, you will be drawing indifference curves for me in the exam, I do not want to see them backwards bending. I do not want to see them bending up again. Because if you do, and I can guarantee this, if you drew them backwards bending or turning up again, I will penalise you marks. Indifference curves typically do this. They slope downwards from left to right. Okay? In the exam, none of these other parts slope downwards from left to right. And so typically, that's what they'll do. But what is an indifference curve? Well, hopefully, you should all remember. An indifference curve, what it does, it takes various bundles of these two goods, hamburgers and tacos. So, this space here, various combinations of these two goods, and we take specific bundles. And we would say to the consumer, of these bundles, which ones do you prefer more, which ones do you prefer less? And once we've identified certain bundles that the consumer says, well, given the choice between this bundle that contains a certain amount of the two goods, and given the choice of this alternative, different bundle that contains different amounts of the goods, which one would I prefer? Well, to tell the truth, I don't mind. I'm indifferent between them. So when we identify all of those points over which our consumer is indifferent, and we connect them up with a line, that is what we get. That is what an indifference curve is. It's just a locus of points that depict equally preferred bundles, or equivalent bundles. And that's all it is. And typically, it will slope downwards from left to right. Now, if we look at that indifference curve, it also has a slope. And the slope isn't constant. The slope of this line is getting shallower and shallower and shallower as we move from the left to the right. And this slope merely reflects the rate at which our consumer is willing to exchange these goods. So if we said to our consumer, how many tacos would you be willing to give up to get more hamburgers? That would be given by the slope of this line. And you can see that typically it isn't constant. It changes. And we'll find, why does it get shallower? Because it means as we get fewer and fewer tacos, if you need to give up more tacos, or if you need to give up additional tacos, you require more and more hamburgers in compensation. It's that simple observed fact that the less of something we have, the more highly we value it. If we have more tacos, what would we need to have? What would we be prepared to give up to get even more tacos? Very little. We have a low valuation on it. But if we have very few tacos, we require an awful lot to give up those little amounts that we do have. So that describes that general shape. And the slope reflects the rate at which the consumer is willing to exchange these goods. And in technical terms, that slope is known as the marginal rate of substitution. The rate at which the consumer is willing to exchange one good for another. And typically, that is the shape of the indifference curve. There will be a diminishing marginal rate of substitution. That slope gets shallower and shallower and shallower. The rate at which we're willing to exchange hamburgers for tacos changes. It's a diminishing marginal rate of substitution. And for everything that I give you, not just the lectures that are going to follow, but also in the exam, that's the type of indifference curve I would expect you to know. Simple, general terms. Downward sloping from left to right with a diminishing marginal rate of substitution. The sort of indifference curves that you would have seen so many times last year in your introductory micro courses. So that's one indifference curve. What happens as we have multiple indifference curves? What does this reflect? Well, we go from an indifference curve to an indifference map. It relies upon a very, very simple principle, where a very simple way of describing this is the pig principle. And the pig principle is the idea that if some is good, more is better. So pig, from your name, a pig. They prefer more to less. And as individuals, humans, consumers, we prefer more to less. If I gave you the choice, do you want one of these or do you want two of these? Which would you prefer? Forget about constraints, what you've got to pay for. Do you prefer one or two? Everyone would say, well, I'd much rather two, so one. It's that basic idea, the pig principle, the idea of non-satiation. If some is good, more is better. So, let's look at that diagram that we've got here. Let's say we've got that indifference curve here, indifference curve U1. And every single point on that indifference curve, the consumer is indifferent between the bundles. She doesn't care any one of those bundles, they're all equally preferred on that indifference curve U1. Well, that point there, point A, on indifference curve U1, if we now said to the consumer, would you prefer that bundle there A, or that bundle there B, which just happens to lie on a higher indifference curve? What would she say? Which would she prefer? She would naturally prefer B. Why does she prefer B? Because it's got more hamburgers and it's got more tacos. So there's no doubt about it, B would be preferred to A. And hence, B lies on a higher indifference curve. And given the choice between any point on indifference curve U1 and any point on indifference curve U2, our consumer would prefer any point on the higher indifference curve. So that's the idea to remember. We know what an individual indifference curve looks like, but as we move out to higher and higher indifference curves, we move to more preferred bundles. Now, if I were to ask you the question, what can indifference curves never do? Apart from bend backwards and slope upwards again. Hopefully that's now taken as given. If you can remember from when you did this last year, the absolute one no-no is indifference curves cannot cross. So if you draw a set of indifference curves, that's what they'll do. They don't have to be parallel. They can get closer to each other. They can move further and further away. But what they can't do is touch one another. Indifference curves cannot cross. So that is something that's completely wrong. Now, why is that completely wrong? Well, obviously, they're crossing. But I want you to think what it implies. Now, we said that any point on indifference curve is equally preferred. So we have indifference curve U1 there. So points B and C, which would the consumer prefer? She doesn't care. They're both equally preferred. They are equivalent in her mind. So B and C are equally preferred. However, let's look at indifference curve U2. And in indifference curve U2, we've got bundle A and bundle C. And given the choice between those two, which would the consumer prefer? Well, again, she would be indifferent, because they're on the same indifference curve, U2. So now we've got the situation where the consumer says, well, I prefer B and C equally. because they're on the same difference curve. But also, I prefer A and C equally, because they are on the same difference curve. Now, is that consistent? The whole point for A and B, they're different bundles. And what can we say about B relative to A? That B is absolutely more preferred. Why? Because B has more hamburgers and tacos. It's that pig principle again. Consumers prefer more to less. So if we offered the consumer bundle A or bundle B, which would she take? She would always choose B, because it contains more of both goods. Yet, from what we've said, if our preferences are consistent, and it's the technical term that you would have learned from last year is the axiom of transitivity. But if preferences are consistent, if A and C are equally preferred, and B and C are equally preferred, it means that A and B must also be equally preferred. But that's not the case here. Absolutely, we can say that B is more preferred to A. And hence, if we allow indifference curves to touch, to cross, it completely violates one of the underlying principles of this theory of consumer choice. And that is that preferences are consistent. And as soon as that happens, the whole theory falls apart. So that, allowing difference curves to cross, is an absolute no-no. Now I'm hoping that the majority, the vast majority of people in this room, if I'd asked you, can indifference curves cross? You would say, no, I can't quite remember why, but I do remember from last year, when we did this, we were told indifference curves cannot cross. And I would never ever draw them for you in an exam such that they crossed. However, I would say probably, if I don't say this next part, I would say that probably 3/4 of the people in this room, in an exam, would draw indifference curves that cross. Okay? So what I want to make sure is that doesn't happen. So, what I'm going to do is ask you, I'm going to get you to use your phones and Kahoot in a moment. I'm going to ask you a very, very simple question. So we've got two indifference curves here. We've got our two goods, hamburgers and tacos, and we've got two indifference curves. Indifference curve U1 and indifference curve U2. Now, indifference curve U2 is further out, so that seems a more preferred indifference curve. Indifference curve U1 is further, less preferred. Okay? The question I want to, it's a very, very simple question. The way that I've drawn those indifference curves, is it possible? Let's I should say, by the way, and I know I've said it before, the point of these questions isn't to trick anyone, it's not to trip you up. If you make a mistake, I want you to make it here and not in the exam. Okay, these indifference curves. Simple answer. Yes or no, do they cross? No. So therefore, I said indifference curves cannot cross. Well, they don't cross. So maybe that says, well, they're okay. So, as 49 of you said, absolutely fine. What's the problem with that? I've drawn that indifference curve U2, but I've only drawn a part of it. Now, again, it's relying upon something that you would have learnt last year when you set up your axioms of consumer choice. You have not just the axiom of transitivity, give us consistent preferences. There's only two principles here. The second one was completeness. That is, consumers are able to judge over all bundles of goods. That indifference curve, U2 there, is that looking over all bundles of goods? No. Obviously, there are all these other bundles up here. So if I extended indifference curve U2, draw it completely, what would happen? isn't going anywhere apart from cutting that indifference curve. Now if I'd drawn that, and I said, is that possible? 100% of people would have said, that isn't possible, they cross. You can't do it. Can't be drawn like that. But when I say that 3/4 of people in an exam would draw indifference curves that cross, I would hope that the vast, vast majority of people wouldn't draw them such that they literally cross each other. Some people will, I can guarantee it. Some people will. But where the majority of people will make a mistake is drawing indifference curves that look like that. Not that they do cross, but that they will cross. That there is as bad as drawing indifference curves that do cross. So remember I said, in an exam, in your exam, absolutely, you will be drawing indifference curves. Okay, so it gives you a very, very clear idea. There will be a question on the exam paper on this topic, theory of consumer choice. Okay, that's not revealing anything too much. But if you draw indifference curves that bend backwards, that turn up, I've already told you, I will penalise you marks. If you draw indifference curves that either cross or will cross, again, I'll take marks off you. Okay? So please don't draw indifference curves that look anything like that. You've got to draw them fully. If you do them such that they cross or they would cross, you're violating one of the fundamental principles of the theory of consumer choice. And what does that suggest? That suggests that you don't really understand an awful lot about this topic. If you understand it, I'm not going to give you the credit. So please, don't draw indifference curves that cross. So that's our indifference curves. All done. Nice, quick refresher. Now, the second part I want to mention, remind you of, was to do with the budget constraint. Now, in its most general form, in a moment I'll put some numbers in for you, because I know you all prefer numbers. For the moment, in its most general form, what do we have? A consumer has a certain amount of income, we'll call it I, that she allocates between two goods, good X and good Y. So she consumes X, that is a certain amount of good X, and she consumes Y, a certain amount of good Y. And the price that she pays for good X is PX, price of X, and the price that she pays for good Y is P of Y, price of Y. Well, the left-hand side here, price of X times X, plus price of Y times Y, that's a total expenditure. Price of X times X is her total expenditure on good X. Price of Y times Y is her total expenditure on good Y. And the maximum her expenditure can be is equal to her income. And that expression here that equates expenditure on the left with income on the right is our budget constraint. And you all know what a budget constraint would look like. It's going to be a straight line like that. What I wanted to do was just remind you about how that budget constraint is identified. And there are three aspects of that that you need to be mindful of. We've got this intercept on the your budget constraint, remember, is just going to be that straight line. In your first year, you might have done non-linear budget constraints, and if there are other aspects of this we're going to cover, I might just dip into them, but absolutely everything you'll get with me, absolutely everything in your exam will only look at a linear budget constraint like this, just a straight line. It's not going to deviate from that. So, given that straight line, how do we draw it? Well, we've got 3 points of interest. We've got the intercept here over on the y-axis. We have the intercept here over on the x-axis, and that straight line also has a slope. Well, I'm hoping that these intercepts here on the y and the x-axis are self-explanatory. On the left-hand side, that point here, that's the maximum amount of good Y a consumer could consume if she didn't spend anything on good X. It's the absolute maximum amount of good Y that she can purchase. And what is that determined by? That is determined by her income divided by the price of Y. So total income divided by the unit price of Y, and that will give you your maximum consumption of good Y. Here, on the right-hand side, that's the maximum consumption of good X. So if our consumer spent absolutely nothing on good Y, what's the maximum number of units of good X she could afford? Well, that will be determined by income divided by the unit price of X. So again, those two should be fairly straightforward. And all you need to do to identify the budget constraint is take these two extreme values and connect them with a straight line. And that straight line will have a slope. And the slope of that budget constraint is equal to minus, it's got to be minus because it's a negative slope. It's running down from left to right. So it's always going to be negative. But it's equal to also the price of X over the price of Y. Well, if you wanted to, you could rearrange that expression there to describe the equation of a straight line, and you would see from that the slope is minus px over py. Very simple to do, but what I want you to remember though, that it's minus price of X over price of Y. Now if students make problems with the slope, it's because they get these two around the wrong way. And the reason you might get them round the wrong way is, you know, a very, very simple bit of calculus. If you were to find the differential of something, what would you do? It's equal to the ratio of the rise over the run. If you've done differentiation, it's dy over dx. And that dy over dx sticks in students' mind. And so they think that the slope is price of y over price of x. It isn't. It's equal to the price of the good on the horizontal axis, I've got x here, divided by the price of the good on the vertical axis, in which case here I've got dy. So that, in its most general term, is the budget constraint. And very quickly, just to put some numbers in there for you, let's say that this consumer had an income of £100 and the unit price of X was £2.50 and the unit price of Y was £2. So, with a price of Y of £2, the maximum amount of good Y she could afford would be 50 units. 100 divided by 2. 100 divided by 2 is 50. The maximum amount of good X she could consume is income divided by the unit price of X. So 100 divided by £2.50. 100 divided by £2.50 is 40. So that's the maximum amount of good X she could afford. And so we just connect these two extreme points with a straight line, and that gives us our budget constraint. And that budget constraint will have a slope equal to minus the price of X over the price of Y. Minus 2.5 over 2 is minus 1.25. So that would be the slope of the line. And that is all a budget constraint is. It's as simple as that. But given the way that I've set this up, what does it mean? It means if income changes, what happens to the budget constraint? It's also going to change. If the price of good X or the price of good Y changes, again, the budget constraint is going to change. And so, that is what I'll run through with you for this last part before I give you a rest. So, the first thing, let's look what would happen if income changes. Can you all remember from what you did before? Got a budget constraint? What would happen if income increases? Can anyone remember? It would shift outwards in a parallel fashion. Well done. Okay. So, let's say that that's our budget constraint B0. Now remember, and that's our initial budget constraint drawn for a certain level of income and certain prices of good X and good Y. Now what determines the slope of that budget constraint? The relative prices of good X and good Y. And therefore, if those relative prices don't change, the slope of the budget constraint will also not change. So an increase in income does what? It affects the maximum consumption of good Y. If your income goes up, if your income doubled, and the price of Y stayed where it is, you could afford to consume twice as much as good Y. So therefore, an increase in income increases the maximum consumption of good Y. And in exactly the same way, an increase in income increases the maximum consumption of good X. So our budget constraint is drawn further out. But it increases outwards in a parallel fashion. Were income to decline, that budget constraint would shift inwards in a parallel fashion. So income increases, budget constraint goes out. Decreases, it contracts back inwards. But if only income is changing, those budget constraints need to be parallel. And why do they need to be parallel? Because the slope is equal to that ratio of relative prices. And if they're not changing, the slope doesn't change. So, that's the first one. Changes in income causes the budget constraint to move. Outwards, increase in income. Inwards, reduction in income. And then, what would happen if the price of the goods themselves change? Ceteris paribus. Other things held constant. So only the price of a good changes. We're not looking at a change in income anymore, only a change in price. Well, got a bit of a definition there for you. So when the price of one commodity changes, other things being equal, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, the budget line moves along the axis of a good whose price changes. So again, think about the endpoints that you identify. If budget constraint B2 is drawn there for a certain amount of income and a certain price of good X and a certain price of good Y, we will have a maximum consumption of good Y on the far left, a maximum consumption of good X on the far right. So if the price, is this a price of X increasing or decreasing? What is it? Increasing. The price of good X in this diagram is going up. So what does that mean? Well, your income hasn't changed, but the unit cost of X has gone up. Therefore, what about your maximum consumption of good X? It's going to fall. You can now afford to buy less of good X. So, that point on the far right contracts inwards. And then we just connect up those two end consumption points, and that gives us our new budget constraint. So the good whose price doesn't change, that's where the pivot occurs. And for an increase of good X, the price line will pivot inwards. If the price of good X were to fall, that line would pivot outwards. And that's all you need to remember from that theory of consumer choice. Now, I did promise I'd give you a break a couple minutes. I want to do one last thing, just to set stuff up for when we come back. So this is then the last part. We've said about constraints, we've said about preferences. Now we need to bring these two together. And the only thing, the only rule that you need to remember is this one here. That consumers will always strive to be on their highest possible indifference curve, subject to their budget constraint. If you remember that, I can guarantee you will never, ever go wrong. Okay. Did anyone need to copy that down? Are you all okay? Always strive to be on the highest possible indifference curve, subject to the budget constraint. If you can draw a budget constraint, and then you can draw an even higher indifference curve that still touches that budget constraint, you've not found the optimal point. So, let me illustrate. I'm going to give you two examples. The first is the sort of thing that I'm going to use in this course as we go along. The second is maybe a little bit of a reminder of what you did last year, but I won't ever expand upon the second point. Firstly, though, what does the decision look like? Well, what I've drawn here is an example of what's known as an interior solution. And an interior solution means that the consumer is choosing some amount of both goods. So we are somewhere in the middle here. So in this diagram, again we've got our two goods, choosing between tacos and hamburgers. This straight line there, B1, is our budget constraint. That's our consumer's budget constraint, drawn for relative prices of good X and good Y, and a given amount of income. So of all the bundles that she can consume, they've got to lie along that budget constraint somewhere. If they're outside of the budget constraint, our consumer simply cannot afford them. She doesn't have enough income at the current prices. If she's inside the budget constraint, anywhere inside that line B1, it means she's not spending all of her income. And if she spends more income, she can get more goods. And does she prefer more goods? Of course she does. That's the pig principle. If some is good, more is better. So, given our budget constraint, which one will the consumer choose? Well, given what we've said, we know absolutely she cannot choose a point outside of the budget constraint. For example, bundle D. She just can't afford it. So that's not feasible. Points within the budget constraint, such as A, again can't be optimal because it means our consumer isn't spending all of her income. And she could buy more. And that would make her better off. So that can't be an optimal allocation. So it's got to lie along the budget constraint somewhere. So, what was the rubric I said? Consumers will always aim to be on the highest possible indifference curve, subject to the budget constraint. Well, given the budget constraint B1, the highest indifference curve that we can draw that touches the budget constraint is that indifference curve U2. And it will just touch, it will be tangential to the budget constraint at point C. Now, if we drew an indifference curve, such as U1, that cut the budget constraint, why wouldn't she consume at B? Why would she rather C? It's very easy, because B is on a lower indifference curve. Bundle B is on indifference curve U1. Bundle C is on indifference curve U2. And all points on indifference curve U2 are more preferred to all points on indifference curve U1. So given the direct choice, if we said to the consumer, which do you prefer, that bundle B or that bundle C, she would say, I would always prefer bundle C. And so that's the one she would choose. And we always adopt that sort of reasoning until we arrive at a point such as C, where it's not possible for our consumer to be on a higher indifference curve. And this is characterised in the diagram that we've got here by a point of tangency, where the indifference curve and budget constraint are just touching one another, where they're tangential. So the slope of the budget constraint, which we said is equal to, in absolute terms, the relative prices of good X and good Y is just equal to the slope of the indifference curve, which we said was the marginal rate of substitution. That's a mathematical technicality. What I want you to remember, point C, the indifference curve, and budget constraint just touch. They do not cross. That is what we're going to have for an interior solution. And then lastly, we've got an interior solution. We also have something that's called a corner solution. Now, a corner solution occurs where the consumer only chooses to consume one of the goods. I've changed this example around slightly. This is now a consumer's consumption of petrol from Esso per week and consumption of petrol from Sainsbury's per week. We have a budget constraint, B1 there, and I have a selection of indifference curves. Now, I did say to you, indifference curves do what? They slope downwards from left to right, and they've got that curve. We have that diminishing marginal rate of substitution. These indifference curves there don't do that. These are some very, very special indifference curves. Now, I did have a Kahoot question. I won't ask you. Can anyone remember, without going through that, what type of goods we have here? If the indifference curve is a straight line, these are examples of perfect substitutes. Perfect substitutes are goods which the consumer is willing to exchange in a fixed proportion. So just to give you an example, I absolutely wouldn't ever test you anything like this. The only reason I put this in is because it's easier for me at these points to draw straight lines rather than a curved one. I would never ever set you questions with perfect substitutes in your exam. Okay, that's not going to be there. You did that last year. For this year, don't worry about it. But perfect substitutes are goods that the consumer is willing to exchange in a fixed proportion. So what have we got here? We've got three indifference curves. U1, U2, U3. Consumer wants to be on the highest possible indifference curve. That is going to be indifference curve U2. The consumer wouldn't choose that bundle there, but just crosses the budget constraint because the consumer can do better, can move to a higher indifference curve. The highest possible indifference curve is that one there, U2, that just touches the budget constraint at point E1, and hence that would be the optimal consumption bundle. Again, goes back to that rubric that I gave you. The only hard and fast rule is that the consumer wants to be on the highest possible indifference curve. And then this diagram here, pretty much the same, but now I've just changed the slope of these perfect substitutes. Where would the consumer be? Somewhere on that budget on that indifference curve? No, because it's not the highest possible indifference curve. This one here is even higher, so the consumer would choose to consume at point E2. And of course we have an even higher indifference curve, but is that one feasible? No. It's outside of the budget constraint. So that is described as a corner solution. That is when the consumer only chooses to consume one of the available goods. But regardless of whether it's an interior solution or a corner solution, it's that rubric. Consumer will always aim to be on the highest possible indifference curve subject to the budget constraint. Last point, just to finish off this whole part about that revision, about that theory of consumer choice. I said that the way in which the theory of consumer choice is set up is that consumers choose over bundles of goods. And so far, all the examples that I've shown you, hamburgers and tacos, Sainsbury's petrol versus Esso petrol, it's all been very, very stylised. You thought, surely the point of this theory of consumer choice, the way that I set it up, is that consumers choose over all goods that are available. And yet we've done a very, very stylised example. So you might say, well, how does this reflect what goes on in the real world? Well, we can address this really, really simply. And the way that we can address this is by looking at composite goods. Now, a composite good is just a name given to a collection of goods. It's a banner of convenience. So, for example, televisions, microwaves, freezers are all distinct goods. But rather than treating them as separate, distinct goods, we could label them under a banner of convenience of household durable goods. And in the same way, clothes or building supplies are also examples of groupings of goods or composite goods. But the question is, why do we stop there? Why do we stop with household durables and building supplies and clothes? Why don't we go even further and create a composite of all other goods? Then we could apply this theory of consumer choice to look at a consumer's consumption of one good relative to all other goods, the most general of frameworks. And if we also say that the price of all other goods is equal to 1, we end up with the following. So, the basic idea is exactly the same as before. We have two goods where our consumer is choosing between. We have good X on the horizontal axis, our good of interest, and we're looking at the consumer's consumption of good X relative to this composite of all other goods. That's all goods apart from good X. We have a budget constraint, and we have an indifference group. So nothing is different. But this all other goods, if we specify the price of that being equal to 1, exactly equal to 1, this axis here would also reflect the consumer's money income. Now, why is that? Well, think about it. If you've got £20, how much of all other goods does £20 allow you to buy? £20 allows you to buy £20 of all other goods. So implicitly, the price of all other goods is 1. And so this axis here will also reflect our consumer's total money income. And that is the most general of frameworks. So even though we've looked at that consumption of one good versus another, this extends to any number of goods, where we have money income on this axis and our good of interest on this axis. On all of the other principles that we've applied about the consumer wanting to maximise welfare by being on the highest possible indifference curve subject to the budget constraint is described perfectly in that diagram there. So if our consumer had a total money income of, let's say, £100, that is what that point there would be. £100 allows you to buy a maximum of £100 of worth of all of the goods. And the slope of that budget constraint will reflect the price of good X. The price of good X over the price of the good on the vertical axis. And the price of the good on the vertical axis is 1. So the price of X over 1 is just price of X. So given the budget constraint, what does the consumer want to do? She wants to maximise her welfare by being on the highest possible indifference curve U1. She will consume X1 amount of good X and have Y pounds left available to spend on all other goods. And that is the most general of frameworks within this theory of consumer choice. So it's pretty much at that point where you would have finished your introduction to the theory of consumer choice last year. Now what I want to do is just move it on slightly, and we'll touch upon something that you probably, again, did do last year, but so whether you understand it or not is open for debate. And this is that idea of income and substitution effects. But you need to understand income and substitution effects. You really need to understand income and substitution effects to be able to cope with next week's lecture. So it's really important that you get to grips with this. And there are a number of questions on the seminar discussion sheets that you'll go through to reinforce this idea. Now I'm mindful that you said 3 o'clock, that you said 5:45 was the cut-off point for the bus. So rather than getting you to do some of the Kahoot questions, I'll just throw these out there at you, just to speed things up a little bit. Let's say that you went over to Tesco's to get a meal deal at lunchtime. And the current price of a meal deal, so you get your crisps, you get your sandwiches, you get your drink, it costs you £3. Yep, that's the current price of a meal deal in Tesco's. And so you might say, well, yep, I go there each and every day I might get 5 meal deals per week. And they currently cost me £3. The question I want to ask you, what would happen if the price of meal deals went up to £12? Would you go hungry? Would you? You've only got 3 things you could do. You could reduce your consumption of meal deals. Well, the price has gone up 4-fold now. I'm not going to buy as many. So you could consume less. You could consume exactly the same. Or you could consume more. So the price has gone up 4-fold, and yet you decide, it doesn't matter, for some reason I'm going to consume even more of these meal deals. Would anyone increase their consumption? No? Anyone stay the same? Who would reduce their consumption if it went up by, assuming this is that you buy meal deals over there? Yeah, the majority of hands about you would reduce your consumption. Absolutely. What does that describe? That describes a very, very basic principle that you all would have known about. As the price of a good increases, you reduce your consumption. That's the very, very staple of the law of demand that you would have seen in the first year. This unwritten law, this guiding principle that if price increases, you reduce your consumption. And that is entirely plausible. That's what you would expect to happen. That is the law of demand. Well, the first question that I threw out at you was who would increase their consumption of these goods? If the price went up, would you also increase your consumption? Well, everyone finished that diagram? Yeah, very simple diagram. Demand and supply. Demand. If the price increased, it would seem very, very strange that you would increase your demand. If you did, that's the sort of demand schedule that we would get. So, at £3, you consume a certain amount, price goes up to £12, and then you consume even more. That would give us a upward sloping demand curve. And when that happens, if consumers increase their consumption following an increase in its price, that is described as Giffen behaviour. Now, I'm not going to spend too long talking about Giffen behaviour, but you can take it as given that Giffen behaviour is not an actual statement upon consumer behaviour. Giffen behaviour, it's sometimes attributed to what happened during the 1840s, during the potato famine. That the observation that as the price of potatoes increased, that peasants increased their consumption of potatoes. Now, there are a whole host of reasons to believe that idea put forward is actually not true. But we're not going to get into that. But that is that's the story that often lies behind the observation of Giffen behaviour. That if prices increase, consumers would increase their demand. Well, theoretically, it's possible. In practice, Giffen behaviour is just not observed. It's a theoretical curiosity. Absolutely, it is not a statement upon how consumers behave. But, just want to give you another example, and it relates to this idea of gift behaviour. Now let's say that you had a job and you were earning pretty much the minimum wage. And you could earn £7 per hour. And you looked at the wage you could get and what you wanted to do with your time, and you said, okay, I'll choose to work 30 hours per week. You could work more, but you said, why do I want to give up my time for a measly £7 per hour? So you decide to work 30 hours per week. Now, if your wage increased to £40 per hour, again, you have that choice to work more hours. Now, would it be worthwhile? Previously, you said, look, I've got my free time. I've got my leisure time. Do I want to give that up for only £7 per hour? But if the wage rate that you had increased to £40 per hour, it's quite plausible that you might decide to work more. So what I've described here is the wage rate is the price of your leisure. You've got one of two things that you can do with your time. You can work, and by convention, if you don't work, we'll describe that as your leisure time. So what is the wage rate? Well, the wage rate is the price of your leisure time. Every hour that you choose to work means that you're not enjoying yourself. You're not consuming your leisure time. So what's happened here is the price of your leisure time has gone up. Wages have increased. That means the cost of your leisure has gone up. And in response, what do? You work less. So you work more. So you cut back on your leisure time. So what we've described here, I should say, but I won't test you this in the exam. This is just to motivate what we're going to do next. Just to give you an idea. So what we've described here, is what we had before, is a downward sloping demand curve. That the price of leisure, the wage rate, increased. And what did? You responded by reducing your leisure time, by working more. And that is entirely plausible. Hope no one here would contest that at all. That seems entirely plausible. So that would give us our conventional downward sloping demand curve. But what would happen if your wage rate went up, not to £40 per hour, but to maybe £1,000 per hour? Or heaven forbid, £10,000 per hour. Would you still, and that's what an economics degree will do for you, would you still respond by working more? Perhaps with that extra wages, well, why do I want to work extra hours? I'm earning all this money, I now want time to enjoy those extra wages. And so, conceivably, your response to your wage rate going up even higher would not be to work more, but rather it would be to work less. And that seems entirely plausible. I'm not pushing the boundaries at all here. So what does that suggest then? That suggests that your demand for leisure time, that curve, rather than sloping downwards, actually slopes upwards. And that is your response to an increase in the price of leisure is actually to demand more of it. And both of those scenarios, the upward sloping demand curve there, and the previous one that sloped downwards, seem entirely plausible. Now, when I mentioned different goods to you before, I said that they're not really a commentary upon consumer behaviour. They're more of a theoretical curiosity. And yet, that example that I've just introduced you to leisure time, and how the wage rate induces people to consume more or less leisure time, both of those scenarios were entirely plausible. Neither of them seemed like theoretical curiosities. So, what that means then, that if we want to answer more complicated economic problems, what you need is something to supplement that microeconomic toolkit that you've been taught so far. And that something else is the ability to decompose price changes into its constituent income and substitution effects. And that's what we're going to do for the second part of today. Now, our plan was to do three things. Firstly, we'd identify income and substitution effects graphically, and I'd give you a definition of what they are. Then we'll go on to look at income and substitution effects in an algebraic framework, and then I was hoping to talk about implications of consumer welfare arising from price changes. Absolutely, I won't be able to cover that last part there. There won't be enough time, hence the slides that I put on the blog, I'll exclude those ones, and you won't be tested on that at all in your exam. So we're just going to stick to that first part there. Identification of income and substitution effects, both graphically and algebraically, via the Slutsky equation. Now, before we start that, I want to remind you about three types of goods. Whenever we look at income and substitution effects, we need to draw a distinction between normal, inferior, and Giffen goods. So, as a reminder for you, a normal good is a good for which there's a positive relationship between income and consumption. Normal isn't just, oh, it's just a normal good. It's not that bandied around term, that common or garden type of good. A normal good is a very, very specific good. It's a good for which an increase in income leads to an increase in consumption. Or conversely, a good for which a reduction in income leads to a reduction in consumption. In terms of income elasticity of demand that you would have touched upon last year, income elasticity demand for a normal good is positive. Income and consumption move in the same direction. Income goes up, consumption goes up. Income goes down, consumption goes down. That is a normal good. In contrast, an inferior good is a good with a negative income elasticity demand. That demand and income move in opposite directions. That demand is negatively related to income. So for an inferior good, if income increases, consumption will decrease, and vice versa. For an inferior good, if income fell, consumption would go up. And to give you an example of an inferior good, as students on limited income, you might enjoy a cup of tea, but you go around Tesco's or your local convenience store and you look at all the brands that are on offer and you can't afford an awful lot. So you buy a budget brand, or maybe buy Happy Shopper tea bags. Okay, it's tea, but only in the name. It's not particularly nice, but that's what you buy as a student on a limited income. What happens though after you graduate? When you get your high-paying jobs and your income increases? You might still want to buy tea, you might still buy tea bags, but you don't buy budget economy brands, you buy a more expensive variety, a better quality variety. But what does that mean about your consumption of these cheap and nasty tea bags? Your income has gone up, but your consumption of these goods has decreased. So that is an example of an inferior good. As income increases, your consumption of that good decreases. And inferior goods are often those goods that are associated with some sort of inferior quality. And as incomes increase, consumers are able to switch away. That's an example of an inferior good. And then lastly, a Giffen good. As we've touched upon before, a Giffen good is a very, very particular type of good. It's also an inferior good. So, there is a negative relationship between income and consumption. But, for a Giffen good, what denotes a Giffen good is that it has an upward sloping demand curve. So a Giffen good is a very, very specific type of inferior good. It's a specific type of inferior good that has an upward sloping demand curve. Now, most inferior goods are not Giffen. Most inferior goods will have a downward sloping demand curve. It's only in one theoretical instance where that inferior good has an upward sloping demand curve, and that is the instance of Giffen behaviour, a Giffen good. So the majority of inferior goods are not Giffen, but all Giffen goods are inferior. So, with that in mind, now what I want to do is go on to the diagram in the handout. Everyone got this in front of them? Yep. So, what we have here then, the diagram might look complicated, but it is relatively straightforward. I should say, by the way, is this the sort of thing that I would expect you to be able to reproduce in an exam? The simple answer is yes. There's nothing particularly difficult about this if you understand it. So make sure if there aren't any, just pass them along to that. So, what we've got here then, and if you read the main text for this course, the Morgan, Katz and Rosen text, when they look at income and substitution effects, they will do the case of a price increase. And all of the diagrams that they do are the case of a price increase. I'm going to do the case of a price decrease. Not because I'm mean or anything like that, well, maybe not. The reason I'm going to do a price decrease is that then you've got the textbook, you know what the outcome should be when prices go up. In lectures, you're going to have all the full diagrams, you know the scenarios when price falls. So we're going to look at the case of a reduction in the price of good X. So the setup that we're going to go through, 3 different types of goods: inferior, normal and Giffen. The setup is all exactly the same. So we've got 2 goods. Good Y on our vertical axis and good X on the horizontal axis. We have an initial budget constraint, and that initial budget constraint is that budget constraint there, B1. And that budget constraint is drawn for a level of income, a certain price of good X, and a certain price of good Y. That defines our budget constraint here. Budget constraint B1. And what does the consumer want to do? She wants to be on her highest possible indifference curve, subject to that budget constraint. That indifference curve is indifference curve U0. Indifference curve U0 just touches that initial budget constraint at point A. So those 2 lines are just touching. It's not crossing. That's the highest possible indifference curve that she can reach. So, all the bundles she could choose, she chooses bundle A and consumes a certain amount of good X, XA, and a certain amount of good Y, YA. And that is the starting point. And in all our diagrams, that will be the exact same starting point. Now, there's a reduction in the price of good X. Income stays the same, the price of good Y stays the same. Only thing that happens is X becomes cheaper. So, what did we say last lecture? Happens a reduction in the price of good X. That budget constraint is going to pivot outwards. The maximum consumption of good X increases. X is now cheaper. So the budget constraint pivots outwards. So the reduction in the price of good X means that we get this new budget constraint B2. So now what does the consumer do? Does she stay at point A, consuming a certain amount of good X and a certain amount of good Y? Of course she doesn't. She can now afford to reach an even higher indifference curve. So now she's got a new budget constraint that she faces, B2, and again, she does the same thing. What is the highest possible indifference curve I can reach, subject to that budget constraint? Well, the highest possible indifference curve is indifference curve U1, and it just touches the budget constraint at point CN. So that movement from point A to point CN is what would happen if we had a normal good. This is an example of a normal good. And that is the observed response. The consumer starts at point A, the price of good X falls, and she moves to point CN. What happens to her consumption of good X? It increases from XA to XC. So price has fallen, she's increased her consumption. That would describe a conventional downward sloping demand curve. Inverse relationship between price and quantity. Price has fallen, consumption goes up. That's our demand curve. However, this movement from point A to point CN can be decomposed, broken up into its constituent income and substitution effects. And that's what we're going to do. So firstly though, I'll give you definitions of what the income and substitution effects are. That movement from A to CN. The substitution effect, I'll give you the definitions first of all, and then we'll go back to the diagram, and then we'll identify these two effects there. Firstly, the substitution effect is the effect of a price change on the quantity demanded. That's going to be the same in all of our definitions. But this is the important part. Due exclusively, due only to the fact that its relative price has changed. The substitution effect is only concerned about changes in relative prices. That's the substitution effect. The other effect, the income effect, is the effect of a price change on the quantity demanded. See, that first part is exactly the same, but now due exclusively, due only to the fact that the consumer's real income has changed. Notice I didn't say income. The consumer's real income has changed. What do we mean by real income? Well, when we look at income and substitution effects, why we concentrate, what we mean by real income, is that we're not interested in the money value per se. We're interested in the number of physical units of a good you can buy. The purchasing power of fixed money income. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that you had a monthly income of £1,000. Well, I'm not interested in you've got £1,000. What I'm interested in is how many physical units of goods does £1,000 allow you to buy? Well, if prices increase, with a fixed money income, you can now afford to buy less physical units. And so your real income, the purchasing power of your fixed money income, has fallen. That's what we mean by real income. So, in the diagram that we saw previously, when we move from point A to point CA, two things happen. With this reduction in the price of good X, the first thing is that relative prices have changed. More specifically, X has become relatively cheaper. The second thing is that the consumer's real income has increased. With a fixed money income, if prices have fallen, our consumer can now afford to buy more physical units. So X has become relatively cheaper, and real income has increased. And it's these two aspects that allow us to identify income and substitution effects. So, back to your diagrams then. We said we started off at A, we finished at point C, N. For a normal good, I'll tell you this part first of all, for a normal good, the substitution effect is that movement from point A to point B. Now, how do you identify that? Well, think about what the definition was. The substitution effect shows only the change in relative prices. We identified that by taking our initial indifference curve, U0, and draw in a hypothetical budget constraint, and it's going to be that budget constraint there, B3, that just touches that indifference curve. Now, why do we do that? Well, remember, we said the substitution effect shows only the change in relative prices. And yet I've said, in the diagram, two things have happened. One, relative prices have changed, but two, the consumer's real income has also changed. So what we want to do is strip away that change in real income. And that's why we draw this hypothetical budget constraint, B3. We know that the effect of this increase in real income allows the consumer to purchase more. If your income goes up, it makes you better off. You can consume more goods. After all, our consumer started on indifference curve U0, and yet she finished on indifference curve U1. So she's better off. Well, her money income hasn't changed. So how is she better off? Because the purchasing power of that money income has increased. That's why she's better off. But we want to strip that away. The whole point about the substitution effect is it only looks at the change in relative prices. The fact that good X is now relatively cheaper. That is the movement from A to B. That is the substitution effect. And the way that we identify it is this hypothetical budget constraint here, B3. This hypothetical budget constraint B3 isn't any old budget constraint, but it has a slope that reflects the new set of relative prices. Budget constraint B3 has exactly the same slope as our new budget constraint B2. So given this new set of prices, this new set of relative prices that our consumer faces, what does she choose to do? Well, she wouldn't choose to remain at point A. She would rather switch her consumption bundles. See, she substitutes towards good X. And that rotation about the initial indifference curve, caused only by the change in relative prices, is the substitution effect. And so many times today, and in future lectures, I will quote that same thing back to you. The substitution effect is the rotation about the initial indifference curve, caused only by the change in relative prices. Good X is now relatively cheaper. So what do? You substitute towards that. She's now consuming XB amount of good X, whereas previously she consumed amount XA. She's now consuming less of good Y, YB, as opposed to YA. So she's altered her consumption patterns because relative prices have changed. And that is the substitution effect. And it's the movement from point A to point B. Increases consumption from XA to XB. Well, if that's the substitution effect, what's left, B to CN, must be the income effect. Remember we said the overall effect, the observed effect, is A to CN. Well, if A to B is a substitution effect, what's left, B to CN, is the income effect. And what is the income effect showing? Well, we said that a consumer's real income was increasing. After all, she's on a higher indifference curve. What's allowed her to attain a higher indifference curve? That increase in real income. And if we look at this hypothetical budget constraint here, B3, that we use to identify the substitution effect, and we look at the actual budget constraint B2 that she faces, this actual budget constraint is further out. So it's showing an increase in income. But when budget constraints move out in a parallel fashion, that's how we denoted an income increase. But it's not an actual income that's increased, it's a real income. And if you look at the distance between that budget constraint there, the hypothetical one, and the actual budget constraint that she faces, it's moved out in a parallel fashion. And that distance denotes her increase in real income. And if her real income increases, it affords her additional consumption opportunities. And because we're talking about a normal good, what happens to consumption with a normal good if income increases? Consumption increases. And so, if you look at point B to point Cn, as income, real income increases, that budget constraint B3 is moving out in a parallel fashion. As real income increases, for a normal good you increase consumption. And so point Cn is to the right of point B, denoting increase in consumption. And so that movement from B to Cn is the income effect for our normal good. Notice though, and this will always be the case for a normal good, the income and substitution effects reinforce one another. They both move in the same direction. They're both increasing, in this case, both increasing the consumption of good X. So price has fallen, the substitution effect increases consumption from XA to XB. The income effect, again, increases consumption from XB to XC. So both effects move in the same direction for a normal good. And that will always be the case. So that then is a normal good. What about these other 2 points on your diagrams? Well, if we had a good that was an inferior good and a non-Giffen inferior good, we'd start off at exactly the same point. We would have our initial indifference curve and budget constraint. Our consumer would be at point A. Now, following a reduction in the price of good X, the budget constraint pivots outwards. If this is now a non-Giffen inferior good, the highest possible indifference curve our consumer could reach would be tangent to the new budget constraint, not at Cn previously, but a point around and about Ci. So, a reduction in price does what? It increases the consumption of good X from point A to point Ci. So what does that mean? Price has fallen, consumption has increased. We go from A to Ci. Our consumption of good X has increased. So the demand curve slopes downwards. Again, the same as before. So nothing's changed. Reduction in price, consumption goes up. What do we want to do though? We want to decompose this change into its constituent income and substitution effects. How do we do that? Substitution effect absolutely doesn't change. It never ever changes. It does not matter what type of good we're looking at. The substitution effect will always be that rotation A to B. That movement about the initial indifference curve. You substitute towards the cheaper good and away from the relatively more expensive good. Never ever changes. Doesn't matter what type of good we're looking at. Where there is a difference though is the income effect. So A to CI is the overall effect. A to B is the substitution effect. B to CI must be the income effect. This time, though, what does the income effect do? It reduces the consumption of good X. And why does it do that? Because we're on about an inferior good. Real income has increased. Our hypothetical budget constraint is shifting outwards. So our budget constraint is going outwards. There's an increase in real income. For an inferior good, income increases, consumption will fall. That was our definition of an inferior good, a negative income elasticity of demand. So, the income effect causes a reduction in the demand for good X. This time then, income and substitution effects are moving in opposite directions. For an inferior good, that will always be the case. Income and substitution effects, opposite directions. So in this diagram, substitution effect increases consumption XA to XB. The income effect reduces consumption from B to C. CI there. But the overall effect, though, is still an increase in consumption. That the substitution effect dominates. For an inferior good that is not Giffen, the substitution effect is always greater than the income effect. Never changes. And then very, very lastly, what would happen if the good that we're looking at was not an inferior good, not just an inferior good, but an inferior good which is a Giffen good? Well, what doesn't change is that income and substitution effects move in opposite directions. It's always the case for an inferior good. If we were looking at an inferior good that's also a Giffen good, we'd move from point A to a point such as CG. On our highest possible indifference curve is now indifference curve U1. Just touches our new budget constraint at point CG. But if you look at that new point, CG is to the left of point A. So a reduction in price has done what? It's reduced the quantity of good X consumed. That would give us our upward sloping demand curve. And the substitution effect doesn't change. It's A to B. As I said, it never ever changes. It's that rotation about the initial indifference curve caused only by the change in relative prices. Income effect, B to CG, moves in the opposite direction, but this time, and it moves in the opposite direction as income increases. It's an inferior good, so there's a reduction in consumption. For our Giffen good, though, we now find that the income effect dominates. So for a non-Giffen inferior good, substitution effect dominates. For a Giffen good, it's the income effect dominates. And it's the dominance of this income effect that causes that upward sloping demand curve that we observed.